Welcome to the Good Christadelphian Talks Podcast. I'm Levi.
And I'm Chris. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
On this podcast, we select one talk a week to help each one of us get the Bible in our daily news feed.
We post at the start of each week for you to listen with a short intro beforehand to kind of set the stage for the talk you're about to hear.
And now, let's hear more about this week's talk.
For our talk this week, we're listening to an exhortation that was given about a week ago by our brother Kelly Robinson from the Verdugo Hills Ecclesia. Brother Kelly gave this exhortation as part of the Simi Hills live stream just this past week, and the topic of his exhortation was on essential. What I thought was interesting about this exhortation, the reason that I wanted to share it, was Brother Kelly is coming at a stay-at-home order from a different perspective than many of us. A lot of the talks and exhortations that I've heard is talking to people about the opportunity of time we have with being at home, trying to make sure that you take advantage of that to focus and not waste your time. Kelly is looking at it from the perspective of what it feels like when you get told you have to go home. Kelly's exhortation was one where he is on furlough from his job and is having to stay at home and being told that he is not essential by the world's standards. And for his exhortation, he's reminding everybody of how essential we are to God. And it was just a different perspective on where you could be looking at from a stay-at-home order like this. I know personally I am still able to work, thankfully, and it's been really busy for me. So it was a good reminder to look at this perspective from the perspective of somebody who isn't able to work and has to stay home, and how that could play with your mind. I thought it was just a good one to share, and a good perspective, both as a reminder for those of us who maybe hadn't thought of it, and also hopefully as a source of encouragement for those who may be in a similar situation and aren't really hearing their perspective be voiced. Really enjoyed this exhortation. Like I said, it was one, when I heard it, I was like, this is a different viewpoint on some encouragement for us to have while we're all at home right now and unable to go in and meet together. So, as always, if you have exhortations or talks or anything of that sort that you have heard of and you really like, please send it in. We've been getting a handful of those, including some kind of like this one where somebody hears an exhortation and sends it over to us and says, this is a really good one, I think we should share it. So please send those over. It's super useful. You know, we're still trying to do a exhortation Friday night or early Saturday morning so that you have access to it over the weekend, and then another one Sunday evening to have something to listen to and be encouraged throughout the coming week. Please keep sending those in as always. And with that, we'll turn it over to our brother Kelly Robinson for his exhortation on the topic essential.
Hello, brothers and sisters and friends. This is kind of like a celebrity moment for me, because my family, this is one of their favorite shows. There's very few times where we gather around the television set at the same time, except for the weekly meeting where we are virtually here at Simi Hills. So I'm actually on the stage. Been on this stage in front of this camera before, kissing my new bride, Christy, at the time Brett Hauer, and making her Robinson right here. And Simi Hills means a lot to my family. So I greet each of you with a digital hug and a digital holy kiss from the Verdugo Hills Ecclesia, and from the Robinson family. We are grateful for the wonderful hospitality and hard work of Simi Hills, and we're thankful for this sustaining us in this odd time. The reasons I'm choosing the subject of essential is because, like many, I'm under a furlough, which means that you are told that you're not essential. You're not valued and important enough to keep on. You need to go home. Now, if I could see a show of hands virtually, everybody raise their hand on their couch, who is also non-essential. There's a lot of celebration nowadays for those essential workers that are doing a good job, and we're glad they're doing that. But what you might not know is the horrible depression and the feelings that people go through when they're told that it's better that you go home. It's better that you do not do anything than to participate. That is hard. You can put your hands down now. Thanks. I'm seeing a lot of empty chairs, so this is odd. I think back to people that are in retirement as I wake up and to decide what I'm going to do today to stay busy as a non-essential worker. And I think, of course, I go to my grandparents. My grandpa Gordon on my mom's side, when I visited him, he would take me to his garage and he would show me what he has built, what he did as a little honeydew or unusual craft project or woodworking. He also showed me what he's working on. And he says it's always important to have that third component, planning what you're going to do next. Having that momentum of what you have done that you could show someone, what you're working on, and what you're doing next is important, he says, to survive this, like a retirement. So I've adopted that. Also, I've adopted humor and communication. My other grandpa, Walt Robinson, my dad's father, he used to tell a lot of jokes using his ham radio. And when I would come visit him in his garage, it was much different. It was clean, and it was many components of the ham radio system with all the lights. And I'm sure that most of those boxes were not required for what he was doing. But nonetheless, he would always joke with me. And he usually, about every other time, the joke would be, "I don't care what your friends say about you. You're a good boy, Kelly." And so taking that to heart, I think he would have really enjoyed this age of Facebook. But trying to stay connected with people was important in his retirement. It's Mother's Day, and I'm bringing up grandfathers. Why is that? Well, behind these quirky grandfathers were grandmothers that had to put up with them. They had to live with them, even though they had all those quirkinesses, whether it be the hermit in the garage reaching out to the world through ham radio, or what is Grandpa tinkering on now in the garage for Grandma Kay. So Grandma Kay and Idris, who are, all these people are passed away. They're in my thoughts. So back on topic, we're living in an age of population explosion. So many more people each generation than the generation before. Sometimes it's hard to feel personal in this age of so many people. Sometimes we're known more as an account number or as a barcode or a username, or maybe instead of a regular license plate, you have a personalized license plate as a cry to be something different. We used to sit in commute hours on freeways. The ones that I participated in were 5 to 8 lanes wide. Everybody's stuck in traffic going nowhere, sitting, lined up in their metal coffin-like cars, going nowhere. Hard to make personal communication with those around you. They might think you are involved in road rage or something. That's the way things used to be. It wasn't like that on the drive here. That was quick. People don't seem to know their neighbors as well as they used to. And often you could feel alone amongst a big group of people. That is very shocking to some people, but whether it's in your ecclesia or in your workplace or amongst even your friends, you could feel alone. You could feel unattached or not essential to the group. If so, perhaps like me, you could gain from this study of this non-essential worker. I'd like to offer words of encouragement to uplift you and to show that you truly are essential to God. So whether or not it's because of careers that have not like our previous generation where people had lived with their job for an entire lifetime of work, or nowadays it seems every 2 to 3 years people are switching. Long-term relationships and friendships don't seem to be the norm anymore, and people feel maybe more and more disconnected. Maybe by the end of this today, you'll feel connected to God and essential to Him. So we've been studying Ecclesiastes lately, as David mentioned in our virtual Bible class. If we could turn to Ecclesiastes 5, there's a couple of verses there I'd like us to consider before we get into our main study of Psalms 139. Ecclesiastes 5:19, every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth has been given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. Employment and being able to enjoy what you've earned is labeled here as a gift of God. Later in verse 20, people, they seldom reflect on their days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. It's a blessing from God to be occupied with gladness of heart about your work and not have to overthink things because there's nothing else to do because you're not working. So many of us have been told we're non-essential. Work, it's better off that we don't go to work, but there's a greater value to the greater society if we're isolated at home rather than working. This can leave you with a depressed or even questioning your self-worth, let alone the humiliation, if you are sharing this with me, that your family is being cared for by something other than your own labor, which we see from Ecclesiastes as a gift of God. At times like this, it's healthy for us to recalibrate, to reconnect and think about why we're valued, loved, and essential to a greater purpose. So Psalms 139, I'm going to break this down very broadly into a couple sections and have it address a problem. So in the beginning, in the first couple of verses, we're going to see how well does God know you? What does God feel is your identity? Psalms 139, if you could turn to it, we'll spend most of our time there. I'll go off into other scriptures and I'll read them to you so you don't have to flip around unless you'd like to. But we'll go through it quickly. Psalms 139, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. God knows you. In verse 2, you know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my goings out and lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. We all have a spouse or a friend where we know which words they use often. This is even knowing you more than that. This is before your words are even formulated, God knows you, knows what you're going to say. Romans 8 speaks of it this way, that the Spirit helps us in our weakness, in verse 28 of Romans 8. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. God knows what you're going through, and he knows you intimately, and he understands your thoughts as you're putting them together. There's comfort in that God knows you. It makes you essential. Also in Gospel of John 14, it says, I tell you, whoever believes in me and does the works that I've been doing, and this is reference to Jesus saying this, and many of the things that Jesus accomplished in his work before this were listed in Isaiah 61 if you want a sidetrack homework assignment. And they will do greater things than these. John 14, 12 through 14. Because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so the Father may be glorified in his Son. And he's asking us, Jesus is asking us, you may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. And that's if it's within God's will and plan for you. Non-essential workers are not given that kind of access, but you have been. God knows you. Going back to Psalms 139 again with verse 5, you hem me in, behind, and before, and you lay your hand upon me. He knows where you've been, he knows where you're going, and he is holding you now. That sounds like he knows you and you're essential. 2 Timothy 2 helps with this in that he says, remember, Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel. And the gospel, if this is new to you, is actually the promises that were made to God's people, prophesying Jesus coming and what he'll do when he returns back to formulate his kingdom. And the reference to descended from David is about the throne of David, the power in which Jesus will sit on when he returns. This is all made possible because of being raised from the dead, resurrection. And later in this chapter, there's lots of argument about what that means. Well, down in verse 19, getting to my point of how is this that God knows you and that you're essential. Nevertheless, in verse 19 of 2 Timothy 2, God's solid foundation stands firm, sealed with an inscription. Imagine like a cornerstone. And on one side it says, the Lord knows those who are his, which could be you. And the other says, everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. And we'll get to that. Going back to Psalms 139, now knowing that there's a monument with that basically says he knows you. Verse 6 of 139, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too lawfully for me to attain. Isaiah 43 puts it more simply and maybe less poetically, but this is what the Lord says. He created you. He formed you. Just like a potter's hands forms you. That's an very intimate description of working with you. And anybody that knows me knows I'm fascinated with vessels, with pottery, with the potter. And if you'd like to look into more about how God works with you that way, I gave a Day of the Word in San Francisco, the San Francisco Peninsula Ecclesia, and you can look that up if you'd like. But it's all about the fact that God is intimately leaning over you and working with you and forming you. He says, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I've summoned you by name. You are mine. So moving on to the next topic, we know that God knows you. How close is God to me? Do you ever get that lonely feeling? Perhaps you're not blessed with being set in a family during this crisis. And you're just going around, and whenever you go out, all you see is the blank mask of a face. You can't tell if people are even smiling at you. Are you lonely? Verse 139, verse 7, 8, and 9. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even if your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. Your right hand can be holding God's hand spiritually. God is close, so do not be lonely. You might think that you're far from him, but he's only a few words away from holding your hand. Just need to ask. You're never alone. Psalms 27 puts it eloquently. In verse 1, the Lord is the stronghold of my life. That sounds like a really strong friend that's holding your hand. And he set me high upon a rock. And then later in that same chapter, Perhaps you're having some family issues and you're really feeling alone. Perhaps you made bad decisions and you're depressed because now you're alone during this crisis. Know that God is there for you. In verse 10 of Psalms 27, it says, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." In order to be received by the Lord, you need to ask. In this world, it's sometimes easy for us to think that no one cares about us. We feel alone in the crowd. But God cares about us. He wants us to accept his friendship. Several times we've read here that God's hand is reaching out to you, that you just need to reach out back and ask for it, and he'll clench it. He sent his son, Jesus, that we might be forgiven, and that he's there for you to take that hand. So how carefully are you made? What's your worth? This next section will go into what your value is. When you're negotiating with your employer, what are you worth? What have you done for me lately? How do we measure our self-worth? The Psalms can help us out. But before that, I remember that our chemical makeup, if we take all of the chemicals and elements that make us up, we're worth about $2.98. Not much. But that does not count the miracle of assembly and the breath of life. Matthew 10:29. Often when I'm in these Zoom meetings, if I'm not paying attention, I look out the window, and the birds are hopping on the cinder block wall amongst the bougainvillea and the roses. And I marvel at the fact of how healthy they are and how well they're taken care of. Well, Matthew 10 actually says, "Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the hairs of your head," well, maybe your head, not mine, "are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." You're worth more than the $2.98. Verse 13 of Psalms 139 will help us with this. "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." So once again, happy Mother's Day. For the most part, a mother will always love you. If something's wrong, talk to her, and long enough you'll see that she does love you. But not having anything on mothers, God understood you in the womb is what this is saying. So the precious life of a baby that's unborn in a mother's womb, God understood that human life. That's what this is saying. In verse 14, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." In verse 15, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth." Ephesians 1 helps us understand blessings and being planned for, and God's plan for you. A wonderful chapter, but just cutting to what we need for this study and this time that we have. In Ephesians 1, verse 3, "He blessed us with all spiritual blessings." In verse 4, "He hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world." In verse 5, "Predestined us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will." It was his good pleasure that he chose you. You that are watching, you that are here, he chose you from Genesis to be part of what his son, who's prophesied, he was spoke of then in prophecy, would work with you so you could bring good pleasure of his will to him, back to God. That sounds very essential. In verse 6 of Ephesians 1, this is what our job description should be as an essential worker of God. To the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved. Each of us have a very unique way that we could bring praise and glory to point out his grace. Each of you can bring something different that is essential, that God would like to have as part of his kingdom, to bring that together. Each of us would do that job slightly differently, but all of us can praise of the glory of his grace. So our self-worth. Section in verse 16, should I make this font bigger, of Psalms 139. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained from me were written in your book before one of them came to be. There's a book about you? Yes, there is. Once again, before your body was formed, you were written about. God has record of everyone who ever lived. He knows us all by name. We matter. Revelations 20 speaks a little bit more of this. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. Important to look into this, if you haven't, about the power of baptism and the power of being linked with the promises that I mentioned a little bit earlier that could be looked into. But your name is written in these books with plans and results. Verse 17 of Psalm 139, how precious to me you are. Your thoughts, God. God's thinking about you? How vast is the sum of them? That's a powerful phrase. How vast is the sum of the thoughts about you? Verse 18, were I to count them, they would be outnumber the grains of sand. Boy, that sounds an awful lot like one of the promises made. And as you look back at the promises, now that we all have so much time, you'll hear that echo. When I awake, I am still with you. So how is God helping you? Should I worry if I know that God is helping me? This next section is about worry. And there's a lot of anxiety out there. There's a lot of what if. And this language in the closing the psalm has a lot to do with what is worrying people in that time. The language and vocabulary. You probably could switch it out to what we're going through. In verse 19, if only you, God, would slay the wicked, away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversities misuse your name. How frustrating that is when you hear the word of God used wrong in hate and as a swear word. Verse 21, I do not hate those who hate you, Lord. I abhor those who are in rebellion against you. Verse 22, I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Here's some comforting words from Jeremiah 29. Just quickly going into the context with this, that God had brought his people back after they had been pulled away. And he was asking them to be essential again in the land. But he was warning them not to listen to the evils of the world around him. So in Jeremiah 29, verse 11, he says that I have plans for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Verse 12, then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. The mechanics of that are very important. He's so quick to want to listen to you, but you have to call out. You have to reach out for him to hold your hand, but he's that close that he can. You will seek me and find me And when you seek me with all your heart, said verse 13, and verse 14, I will be found by you, declares the Lord. Call out and he'll find you. So don't worry. God's there to help. I wanted the reading about Paul's conversion on the road to be written because we don't have a lot of time to go through this. And if you don't know Paul's story, go back and read it again and again. What you'll find out is that he was a very special person. I believe everyone is. We all have a different special purpose. His vessel, his pot, was being used for dishonorable purposes. He was persecuting the church, the early ecclesias. He was fighting Jesus instead of fighting for Jesus. He was fighting Jesus. God turned that pot around and helped him get cleaned out by the help of Jesus and repurposed. Verse 15 of Acts 9 says, go thy way. He was speaking to Ananias. He is a chosen vessel unto me. So that vessel wasn't being used correctly, but he was chosen. And when Paul received sight, he rose and was baptized. Very important. So that vessel was then used, and an argument could be made more than any other vessel is recorded in the New Testament other than Jesus. 2 Timothy puts it this way. 2 Timothy chapter 2. He describes that there are many different articles in the house, some made of different things, and they all have special purposes. And some, it says in verse 20, have a common use. That's a polite way of saying that it's really disgustingly dirty because of how it was being used. Maybe you've neglected some things. Maybe you've taken God's gift of your vessel and done some horrible things with it. It's not too late, if you're not baptized, to be cleansed. Because God from the beginning didn't have that purpose of how you misuse that vessel. He had a way for you to use that same vessel that you got dirty in a way that will bring him glory. Baptism is a step for that. If you're already baptized and you look back with shame about how the vessel was used, which is your life, it's not too late. Just like Paul, you can be pulled aside. Ask Jesus to help you with this. Ask for forgiveness. Ask how your vessel can be made holy. In verse 21, they cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments or vessels, depending upon the version, with special purposes to be made holy, useful to the master again. So I'm going to sum up some of the things that we've learned, just reading them real quick. I'm sure that some of them are greater impact than others with you. You are loved. He gives us the gift to rejoice in our labor. He keeps us occupied with gladness of heart. God knows you specially. He searches our hearts before we can even have thoughts into words. He imprints his name on the foundation of his plan and in the book of life. Commit to his son, and then God will refer to you as his. Commit to his son, and then God will refer to you as his. That is essential. It's because he planned for you. He formed you, and he has redeemed you. Or he can redeem you. He calls you by name. Even when you think you are too far, he is close to you once you turn and ask for him. He will offer you his hand to hold yours and lead you. You are priceless and wonderfully made, a higher creation. God knew your purpose before you were even born. Your conception wasn't even hid from him, and he knew you in your mother's womb. You are blessed spiritually. You were chosen from the beginning of the world to be holy, to be without blame. That's because you could be adopted by Jesus, to be given to God for his good pleasure and will for the praise of his glory. That's your job description. By grace. It's the only way that's possible. God thinks of you more than you do. He has plans for you, for hope and a future. God asked you to pray to him through his Son, as he wants to listen to you. He's leaning forward, waiting to hear from you. He knows your hearts and your thoughts. He wants to lead you from safety, from troubles, and to stay away from wickedness. Maybe you've had bad choices for your vessel used in common dirty purposes rather than God's work. You know that. If you do, he has provided his Son, Jesus, who we're going to remember today, as a way in baptism to cleanse you, because he has a special purpose for you. You're essential. We have a God-shaped heart, a God-shaped hole in our heart. There is a space here that was created that only God can fill. We are each uniquely, to truly fill this emptiness that you could be feeling, it's essential that you need God. We are each uniquely made to bring God unique praise and glory, as only we individually can, and he wants you to. That's what makes you essential to God as well as to others.
Thank you for listening to the Good Christadelphian Talks podcast. Please subscribe for new episodes and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever service you are listening from to help people find the show when they search for it. If you enjoyed this talk, share it on social media so other people can find it too. For show notes and links to the talk that you just listened to, visit our show page at anchor.fm/GCT. We want to encourage everyone to share their thoughts from the talk this week on Facebook or Instagram, where we are at Good Christadelphian Talks, or on Twitter, where we are at GCT_podcast. If you know of a great talk, we want to know about it too. Send a suggestion to goodchristadelphiantalks@gmail.com or message us on any of our social media platforms. Thank you for listening. God bless, and talk to you next week.